Hi and welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, welcome, bienvenue to today's webinar. The webinar titled Shaping France Solar Market, Exploring the Effects of the Renewable Energy Acceleration Act. I'm very proud to be hosting this webinar today. My name is Ramses. I'm a project manager at Solarplaza. I will briefly outline today's agenda. So we first have a small introduction about background and the rationale of this webinar. Then we will listen to a very insightful presentation by Aurora Energy Research, our very valued, very often presenters at the Solarplaza webinar series, who will be going into depth on the new French Renewable Energy Acceleration Law. We are joined by Alexander Dantin and Joshua Margulies, and then after the presentation, we will do a Q&A. So feel free during the presentation to send in your questions in English or French, that's both fine. So we will have some minutes to discuss the questions, and then we will finish this webinar. So a very brief note about Solarplaza. So we are one of the knowledge centers in the PV network. We are focused on sharing knowledge and network around solar, and we do this through our high-level events, which we've been doing for almost 20 years. As you can see on the map, we have a truly global operating mindset because we are based in Rotterdam, but we have organized events in all continents. And again, this year we have a very full, wide range of events planned. So make sure to check our website to see our latest lineup. We also connect 60,000 PV professionals, not just at the events, but also in our newsletters, or for example, our resources, or in webinars like this one. On top of that, we also have a Solarplaza consultancy, who is your partner for market entry and project development opportunities in markets throughout Europe. So feel free to, if you're looking to expand your business, to have a look on the website and get in touch and schedule a virtual coffee. There's also a Solarplaza Foundation, which is targeted to accelerate the sustainable energy transition for all, with numerous activities, as you can see in the right side of the screen, mainly empowering projects and also enabling network building and sharing knowledge about projects in support with several partners, which are mentioned in the bottom of the screen. Again, feel free to get in touch if you would like to know more or explore the opportunities. This webinar is a part of the content series for our Solarplaza Summit France, which is a yearly annual summit in Paris. It always happens to be in June, which is a pleasant time to be in Paris as well. We are organizing this summit with several dedicated partners, and it will be a very insightful day to empower yourself and to get your the latest knowledge and the latest information on the solar PV market. There will be a wide range of speakers, ranging from the biggest banks to the grid operators to several key developers, as well as many others to give you the latest information needed on the French market. Then let's move shortly to the webinar. Just some last practical notes. If you have any questions, then feel free to use the question box, because we are answering these questions, or at least we try to answer all your questions after the presentation. So again, English or French, that is both fine. If you have any technical issues, then use the question box as well and direct them to us, and we will be there shortly with you to help you to resolve this question. The slides and the recordings will be made available, so you can fully focus on listening, and you will receive all the notes and all the information after this webinar. Then I'm happy to present today's speakers. Firstly, I would like to ask Alexander to turn on his camera and say hi. Hi, Alexander.
Hello, thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Alexander is the research lead at Aurora Energy Research, mainly in charge of power market modeling and analysis for the French and Iberian market. and we'll also be speaking later this year at the Solarplaza Summit. So I'm very happy to have Alexander here, accompanied by Joshua Margulies, a senior associate at Aurora Energy Research, who's also focused on Aurora's expertise, energy research expertise in the French power market. So also happy, Joshua, to have you here today. A pleasure. And now I will pass on the virtual microphone to Alexander. Thank you.
Thanks.
And
yeah,
we go to the
perfect. Okay, so just a few slide on who is Aurora first, and then we will enter the content, which will be on the renewable acceleration law, and also any question that you might have on the solar PV industry in France. So basically, Aurora Energy Research provide market-leading forecast, so forecast going to 2060 in order to be used for like investment, and we are clearly recognized by bank in order to make your investment viable. So we are looking at all the market that you are seeing on the screen. We have an office in Paris, which might be interesting for you, and we are looking at renewable, obviously storage, and also all the different things that we look in the energy system. And I will go the other way, and basically just to understand how we organize, all the model and data are inside the company. So we develop our model, which is quite specific at our company. We have a kind of subscription, so subscription layer that I lead for France and Iberia, and afterwards there is also a consultancy part, which is the most customized part, which Joshua is also doing in France, and in the middle we have some software solution that if you might be interested, Joshua might talk about at the very end of this presentation. But as you didn't come here to discuss about Aurora, let's go into the detail in the other direction, obviously. Sorry for that. So just like setting the scene, so understanding where we are in terms of solar in France is quite important before like going into this renewable acceleration law. So the first thing we will look at is basically what was the recent development in France. And what is quite interesting to see is that even if the early, like the from 2010 to 2020, the development was about like 1 gigawatt per year of solar installed every year. We saw that the last 2 years, these like quite develop, like the rate of development increase quite a lot, with 2.7 and 2.6 gigawatt per year in 2021 and 2022. This looks like quite interesting, but if we look at the government target, which is the PPE, in order to reach those, which is basically a target in 2028 that the government has set, there was 2 different targets, but basically what happened is that these 2, we had a low target and a high target. And in order to reach those, as of 2022, we would need like 3.3 gigawatt per year in order to reach the lower target, and 4.7 gigawatt per year in order to reach the high one. So basically, even if we saw like we see like this increase of yearly build in the last 2 years, it seems that there is definitely some progress to be made in order to reach the targets set by the government. On the other part of the slide, we will look at the recent auction that has taken place. So basically, these auctions are done by the CRE, the regulator in France for electricity. And basically, the two auctions that I put on this slide is the ground mounted one and the rooftop solar. It's quite interesting to state that in the past, most of the capacity was coming from auction, so from subsidy. By auction, I mean that's a CFD, so a double size CFD. So you gain money if you are above of the price you bid, and you pay money if the base load is higher than the price of your CFD. So that's interesting to put in perspective. And as all the most of the capacity was coming from these CFD scheme, it's interesting to see at what they have been, what kind of capacity did we see there. And what is interesting to look at is basically I put all the auctions from 2020 on to 2022 and all that are published, and the recent last two from ground mounted, so are heavily undersubscribed, which is interesting to understand as well. And on top of this undersubscription, there is as well quite a big increase of the price which was bidded by the developers in order to construct those projects. So even if in the past price stagnate a bit or even went a bit lower, we see that in the last auction the price went higher due to the fact that capex increase. We might also see some opportunity costs between this and selling a PPA at exorbitant prices that happened when prices in France were extremely high. Nonetheless, it seems that capex is definitely part of the reason why the price went higher. And on the lower part of the graph, we see the same kind of story for the rooftop, where these auctions are heavily undersubscribed. On this one, there is another additional phenomenon that we need to add to the story, is the fact that in the past, the capacity auction through the subsidy were way lower. And now we auction between 300 and 400 megawatts each auction, which due to the different actors told us that basically they didn't have the pipeline in order to fill all these auctions. Nonetheless, this explanation we were able to have this explanation in 2021 and 2022. Now that we are in 2023, we still see this auction heavily undersubscribed, and similarly the price are going higher. So that's part of the story, and another point that I want to look at before going to the renewable acceleration law is definitely what is the different hurdles that basically a developer will see in order to put a renewable asset, and more in particular a solar asset, inside the grid. So basically we categorize those as 4 different types, and put a kind of ballpark view of how annoying is it in France to put solar, and which step is the most problematic, I would say. So we have land availability, regulatory requirement, permitting, and grid connection. And for the first one, land availability, as much as France is the biggest European country, it's quite hard to find available land for the construction of solar PV. Basically, the ground-mounted solar development was limited, or This slide was done just before the Renewable Acceleration Law, so Joshua will talk about that later, and it was only for terrain dégradé, which becoming very scarce, and as people owning those land knew that they were quite scared, the price went up quite a lot, meaning that it was more and more difficult to introduce a large ground-mounted solar asset in the French system. Another thing is also that there was some confusion about agri-PV, which is also something that Joshua will talk about later on, and basically needed to be demonstrate that agri-PV was not didn't make the soil more artificial, and there are synergies between agriculture and solar. Yeah, there was a big work done on this subject recently by the French government, and the Renewable Acceleration Law is talking about that. There is also some regulatory requirements, that there are a number of authorization needed, the fact that there are a lot of planning complexity here, and I would like directly to jump on the permitting, which is definitely the most, it was one of the most one of the biggest problem for solar developer in the past, and let's see if it's still the case in the future. But basically, a solar asset, in order to do complete development, could take from 3 years in the best case to 10 years, and mainly due to the lengthy building permit processes. So that's something that the Renewable Acceleration Law will try to tackle, and as well the fact that in the past 1 on 3 build permit application were seen as unsuccessful. Something that was a bit less problematic is definitely the grid connection. At least in France, because in other part of the world it is the case. And basically, yeah, so it's less of a concern. It's also interesting to see that in Europe there are some most of the problem are definitely technical rather than economical, at least to a certain extent, and that basically grid connection is less the big problem in France. So as mentioned quite a few times on this slide, the Renewable Acceleration Law tried to tackle most of these challenges in order to fasten the renewable build out. So let's see if exactly what's the scope of it, and basically how it turned out at the end. So now, just making a quick overview on the Renewable Acceleration Law. Wait. Yeah. And what we see here is basically a summary of what happened in the past year, even in the past 6 months, I would say. And basically, where do we start with this Renewable Acceleration Law is the fact that France was one of the only, even not the only country not to fail to achieve their renewable development target. So being fined 500 million euro in November 2022, and it's basically quite synchronized with the moment this Renewable Acceleration Law was voted by the Senate, where you can see the timeline on the upper part of the slide. 2022, as many of you knows, were quite a crazy year in terms of electricity prices due to the Ukraine war, and basically as well even more in France due to the fact that the French nuclear fleet was quite unavailable, leading to extremely high prices. And then it was quite a timely timely moment in order to push for this renewable acceleration law. So it's basically what the government did, and basically maybe the root of all this is also the speech at Belfort in February 2022 by Emmanuel Macron, in which he claimed like 100 gigawatt of solar, among others, and some new nuclear, which were, I think, the two main thing to put forward. So you can see on the upper part of the Renewable Acceleration Law the timeline of it. So first voted by the Senate, etc., the different version. It was officially published on the 10th of March, so it's still quite recent. And basically, before my colleague Joshua will go into the details of it, I would want to basically set the high-level objectives that this renewable action law had. So the first one was definitely to accelerate the administrative procedure for renewable assets, improve the acceptance from renewable project, and also simplify the development and planning. Afterwards, look at how do we free up more degraded and artificialized land, and also, in this context, try to accelerate solar and agrivoltaics. A third objective was also pushing much more for offshore winds. So that was quite a big shift in the past, where France had quite some trouble since like the beginning of the last decade to push offshore wind in the French seas and ocean. But yeah, it seems that this has passed, and now offshore wind is clearly a key asset that will be pushed into the system. So definitely offshore wind and other measure with that. And last but not least, try to improve the value sharing with local stakeholders. So before entering this kind of detail on the law, like maybe something to watch out in the French regulation space as well for 2023 and early 2024 is definitely the PPE. So basically, the PPE, as I mentioned, with the low and the high target for solar, is currently reviewed and will be done in the near term. So it might be something that will add another vision of where France wants to go in terms of renewable targets for the more medium-term future. So having set the scene, I will now leave the floor to Joshua, that will explain more in details this renewable acceleration law.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. So I mean, this renewables acceleration law is really, in a way, it's its own pioneering law. It's the first time that the law is specifically dedicated to renewables. And the context of it is that, obviously, as Alexandre said, France just paid 500 million euros in penalties for not achieving its national targets. And so in that context, the French government proposed a series of measures which were institutionalized in a law. And I think there are really three key points that are cross-technological, that cover all technologies, that are to be pointed out. First of all, there's the creation of what we call the renewables acceleration zones. So essentially, what are those acceleration zones? They are specific parcels of land that mayors allocate specifically for renewables deployment. In those zones, the instruction time by public authorities is limited. Renewables assets benefit from all kinds of advantages, such as their CFD bids that can be modulated upwards. They can have kind of more advantageous interpretation by the judge if ever there's a recourse, and environmental authorizations must be delivered more quickly. So this is specifically important in the context of the French difficulty of getting renewables out of the pipeline. And the point of this, so the French law says it very clearly that those zones are being set by mayors, so mayor after mayor, municipality after municipality, but they have to be commensurate with national targets. If a mayor does not provide enough land such that it won't be able to reach national targets, then the prefect, meaning the representative from the state, can force the mayor to submit a new renewables acceleration zone. So this is a major advance for renewables. It will free up a lot of land which will be specifically devoted to RES deployment, but there are some downsides, as usual. Assuming that a mayor will have proposed, will have suggested a zone that is large enough to reach national targets, he or she can then restrict other zones. Ramses, I see that you may have something to say.
I have one quick question, Joshua. Could you maybe check for you have a bit of an echo. Could you check if your microphone of your speaker and your computer are compatible? It was okay in the beginning, but now there came an echo.
Fine. They should be fine. Is it still the case now?
Yeah, it's still the case.
Give me just one little second, if you don't mind. Sorry, I'll be here in a second. I'll bring my audio. Give me a second.
Yeah. Maybe anytime, Alexander. Oh, no.
It might be better now.
Not yet.
Be better now? Is it better now?
Yeah, now it's better. It's better.
Ah, okay, great.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes, thank you for noting this. So essentially what I was saying is renewables acceleration zones will provide some piece of land specifically for renewables, but the downside is that once mayors will have instituted those acceleration zones, they can then on the side institute exclusion zones, which will hamper renewables development outside of those acceleration zones. And the other point that is not addressed by the government is that there might be real estate speculation on those specific zones, given that every developer will be vying for development on those specific zones. So this is one of the main elements of the law. Another element is what we call the imperative reason of major public interest. Essentially what this says is that whenever renewables are on a parcel of land which are generally protected for reasons of natural habitat or geological reasons, then they have that status that allows them to go forward and to not be hampered because it's a zone that's protected for natural reasons. The downside again is that the specific renewables that will be given that status as imperative reason of major public interest will be spelled out in a decree. So we don't know yet exactly under what conditions renewables will have that status. And finally, the last element, which is of specific importance to all technologies, is what we call the guarantee fund against legal recourses. So essentially, very often what happens is that developers get an environmental authorization. Great, good news. Then there's a recourse by local stakeholders, the mayors, people who live around. And then the judge decides against the national authorities and invalidate the environmental authorization. So what this means is that developers will be able to subscribe, obviously for a per megawatt hour fee, for a per megawatt fee. They'll be able to subscribe to this guarantee fund, and if ever there's a legal recourse that invalidates an environmental authorization, then what happens is that those developers are then reimbursed the costs. So this is one of the major advances of the renewables acceleration zones. If we perhaps move to the next slide, Alexandre. I'm not going to spend too much time on onshore wind, but essentially what needs to be said is that the law is not as advantageous for onshore wind as it is for solar. Specifically, prefects can now deny the delivery of an environmental authorization if they believe that in their region there is a visual saturation, meaning an over too many wind farms in their specific regions. And so obviously the point of this is to be able to push developers to install their wind farms in a more geographically distributed way across the French territory. But given that wind yields are also quite homogeneous in certain regions, it might hamper onshore wind development. Additionally, onshore wind farms cannot be placed in national parks, but not just national parks, they can't be placed in what we call Natura 2000 sites, which are specific sites that are protected under European law for biodiversity reasons. So essentially what this does is that it places additional restrictions on onshore wind development. However, things are much brighter for solar PV. And this is what we're going to see in the next slide. Essentially what the Renewables Acceleration Law does is that it gives a huge boost to the solar industry. Three things. One is that it defines for the first time agri-PV. It gives it a regulatory definition. And so essentially what agri-PV assets need to fulfill is they need to be on an agricultural parcel, they need to contribute to the agricultural yield, they mustn't be irreversible. So there are all kinds of criteria, but once you satisfy those criteria, you can have all the advantages that come with agri-PV, among which the possibility to have a specific agri-PV auction. So, agri-PV assets are typically a bit more capex intensive than ground-mounted or rooftop solar. And essentially what the law does is that it calls for the institution of a specific agri-PV CFD auction. What it also does is that it asks prefects to create privileged zones for agri-PV development. And the way those privileged zones work is that they have the same regulation as an acceleration zone. So that means they're going to have reduced and streamlined instruction by public authorities. They're going to benefit from more often positive outcomes by the judge, and it's going to be tougher to submit recourses against them. And finally, it's a measure that that went unnoticed essentially, but parking lots that are larger than 1,500 square meters will have to put solar panels covering half of their surface. And ADEME did a study on this, and it shows that about 4 gigawatts of solar could arise as a result of this very quickly. And so what we plotted on the bottom right is what would happen if, on the basis of the current trend plus this obligation, we installed 4 gigawatts, and essentially what happens is that we nearly reach PPE targets, meaning national targets. We're now very much, we're lagging behind, and if we put it, we might just about reach the lower end of the 2028 target. So essentially what this shows is that the Renewables Acceleration Law will be a huge boost for the solar industry, both for typical traditional solar PV assets, but also and specifically for agri-voltaic assets. So perhaps, conscious of time, we're going to spend perhaps another 5 minutes and then wrap up. Alexander, if you can move to the next slide. So what are the key uncertainties? Because it's not just positive, there are still uncertainties. So this presentation was made slightly before the Constitutional Council submitted its decision, and essentially this Constitutional Council approved most of the dispositions of the measures in the law. Over the long term, though, we read the entirety of the law a few times, and we counted the number of times that the law mentioned that the government needed to publish a regulatory decree in order to give additional precisions to the law. What happens very often with French law is that the law gives general orientations. It sets out priorities, it it sets out what the rules are going to be, but then the specifics, the regulatory specifics, must be spelled out by national authorities. And so what we see is that on a lot of matters, including the definition of agrivoltaism, on the conditions that allow eligibility for status of major public interest, for the conditions under which one is eligible to the guarantee fund, all of those will be spelled out later on. And so there is still quite a lot of uncertainty. In any case, regardless of those decrees, what remains is that this law is a significant boost to the renewables industry, which now enjoys significant political and administrative and judiciary momentum. And the notion, the issue of administrative and legal recourses is now very much top of the agenda for all stakeholders. So essentially, this is despite all the limitations and the doubts, for the solar industry specifically, this law will act as a huge boost. And so perhaps finally going to the next slide, Alexandre. How does this, I mean, very quickly, how does this fit into what we do? Obviously, we at Aurora forecast the price of electricity and the future electricity mix. And for that, we need to understand very specifically what are the regulatory, political, administrative incentives for renewables development. And so what we have specifically in France is a service, typically for renewables developers, but also investors and banks, where we look at long-term forecast of the French energy system, and where we produce an hourly forecast of the price of electricity up until 2060. We've also started developing a service that looks at batteries. So batteries is also a very strong complement to solar assets, and we've developed a specific France flexible energy market forecast. With this in mind, it's now 4:40. Ramses, I suggest, I mean, if that's okay with you, what we could do is answer questions. In any case, I think the key takeaway is that there are still a few uncertainties with the Renewables Acceleration Law, but it will specifically address some of the issues that solar developers have confronted valiantly over the last few years.
Yes, great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to both of you, Alexander and Joshua. This was a really insightful presentation on a lot of facets or a lot of aspects on of the new law, touching upon a lot of developers' issues. Yes, we do indeed have some time for questions. There are some questions already asked. Feel free also to the audience to use this time as well to think of any questions that you would like to ask to Alexander and Joshua. I'll start with the first one. So you mentioned a bit of your presentation was about the renewable energy acceleration zones. One of the questions asked is, are there already designated renewables acceleration zones in place? So feel free, either of you, to take up this question.
Yes, I can take it. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Yep, perfect. Yes, so the answer is no. There are no acceleration zones yet. This is also one of the limitations which I didn't get into in this presentation, but essentially the law sets out a very long process which involves a lot of different stakeholders, mayors, prefects, regional energy councils, TSO, the state, etc. And at the end of this process, it's only at the end of this process that renewable acceleration zones will be set out, meaning the actual borders, the frontiers of those zones. And this process might take as long as 4 years. According to our own reading of the law, it would take about 2 years. In any case, we won't get any zones in France before 2025.
Okay, that is still quite some time.
Yes.
And then also about building permits. So you mentioned as well the building permits have been a bottleneck. What is the reason behind this bottleneck? For example, why have the building permits been unsuccessful? So what exactly is the bottleneck here?
Alexandre, do you want to take it? I can, as you wish.
Yeah,
so
go for it.
I'll go for it. So perhaps I mean, first of all, is understaffing of the dedicated kind of teams in French authorities for giving those environmental authorizations. Second of all, I mean, this is something that we've seen recently with the auction, the latest kind of 1 gigawatt plus auction in France for solar. A lot of the projects were denied because they did not meet all the conditions, because there was small additional criteria that were added, which were insignificant in nature, but which most developers had not seen. And the third reason is also just the length of the recourses. So it's one thing to get the authorization, and then it's another thing to get over the recourse.
Okay, feel free to also add anything, Alexander, if you'd like to. Otherwise, there's still plenty of questions. Maybe then the next question, also again to both of you, are there specific rules or objectives that are dedicated to solar versus wind versus other renewable sources, or is the law more generic in addressing renewable energy targets and policies?
Like on the renewable itself, like I'm not sure to understand the question, to be frank.
So whether there are differentiated objectives between solar versus wind versus other renewables, or whether the law is more generic.
Yeah, no. So basically, as Joshua mentioned in the different deep dives, there is clearly a focus on offshore wind and solar here, in this renewable acceleration law, and it's also, you can make the parallel with the announcement that was made in Belfort in February 2022, where basically it was clear that the push was more on onshore wind and solar with 100 gigawatts by 2050. So yes, there was kind of like a kind of trajectory that was taken by the government pushing for these two assets.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So back to the renewable energy acceleration zones. So on what basis will the renewable energy acceleration zones be dedicated? Could there be any anticipation by a set of regulatory frameworks?
Could it be anticipated by regulatory frameworks? Sorry.
Yeah. So on which basis do you believe the renewable acceleration zones will be dedicated? What will be the basis for determining the acceleration zones?
On the basis of what criteria will mayors decide that zone rather than that zone? Well, that's a very good question, actually. What will probably happen, and this is perhaps unfortunate, is that mayors will dedicate the topologically, or kind of the unsuitable land, or perhaps some of the land that will be provided to renewables will be less suitable than the types of lands that renewable developers would prefer. And so it's specifically to address that measure that the government has set out that the renewables assets under those acceleration zones can benefit from modulated CFD bids, meaning that the government anticipated that the onshore wind farms will be in areas with lower wind speed, that the solar assets will be in areas with less irradiation, and so your volume will be slightly lower, but you can modulate upwards your CFD bid. But it is indeed very possible that mayors will act a bit reluctantly and a bit half-heartedly, and they will provide the suboptimal parcels of land to the developers.
Yeah. Okay. As long as that doesn't lead to a strike in France. Maybe another question. Given the quite rigid nuclear baseload in France, which of course is a big part of France's energy mix, as well as the lack of flexibility in the French energy system, do you consider France also a promising market for energy storage systems?
Yeah, so I can take this one up. So first thing on nuclear is the flexibility of nuclear. So the first point is to say that yes, nuclear is can be seen as inflexible. In France, is less the case than in different countries in Europe. So basically, we saw, for example, end of December, that there were like a lot of wind, and you see the nuclear production that is like going down a lot. Does that mean that it's sustainable in the long term? That's another question. But basically, saying that nuclear is not flexible would be like too quick, I would say. Nonetheless, is France a good place for energy storage? I would think so, and I would think so as well for with solar. So basically, the kind of collocation between like solar assets and storage is something that we are looking at. They are like different revenue streams that are coming up. So basically, we look at the AFR, so the secondary reserve, which is like something that is used by RT in order to keep the grid safe, and it's basically something that we are modeling. So if feel free to keep in touch. And there is also the point that there is a particularity to France is the TURP, which is a cost that you need to pay when you take like energy from the grid. So basically, it's a hurdle for like the development of battery storage alone. But if you combine this with a solar asset like the collocation makes definitely more sense. And looking forward, we can also assume that solar will not be able to capture the same amount of value than the baseload prices. So basically, there will be a decorrelation between what value the solar asset can capture and the price that we see on a day-to-day basis due to cannibalization effect. And battery can help in that kind of setup. So is like a battery or energy storage as a whole is needed in France, or is something that will come up? I definitely think so. It's just the rate and who enter the market first. That will be interesting to see as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Let's do two more. So you also mentioned, I think it was in Joshua's part, about the parking lots. So also the potential if we install the parking lot policy. So can these solar parking projects also benefit from subsidized prices through auctions or any other mechanisms? So how will this be stimulated?
So, I mean, how would this be stimulated? Simply by means of regulatory obligation. The owners of those parkings are obliged to have solar assets on them. Nothing stops them from getting them by means of a PPA, or having having a developer develop those assets directly on the parking lots and via a CFD. So nothing precludes long-term kind of auctions.
Okay, and then maybe a question to round off for Alexander, also for both. I remember, I think your presentation last year was also about this topic. So how in terms of renewable pricing and cannibalization of renewable asset cannibalization, how do you think that the new law will impact renewable pricings and also cannibalization? Yeah,
so that's definitely a good question. Like basically, even if we see the law as helping solar development, we won't like go from 2.5 gigawatt to 10 gigawatts per year. that's not the magnitude of the law, or at least like it's not like the kind of push that we are seeing. So and basically because you can refer to these kind of changes from, like, for example, the German government or what's happening in Spain currently. So even if you can see a bigger like cannibalization in the future, it will still be mild and basically or at least not more than what we expected. And basically what are the ways to prevent those, or at least to help yourself to diversify. So basically you can think about trackers. That's something that you can put into your business model, which is quite a simple one. Afterwards you can think about flexibility, so basically using battery as well. And third, you can also look at hydrogen as a whole. Is something that solar assets connected with also like onshore wind can help you put forward and diversify your business case. Obviously, this it's important to note what are the driver in the other direction, like what would help the solar assets. So the more battery that will enter the market, the better. The more electrical vehicle and the more smarter they are, the better as well. So the kind of lithium issue that we had recently in Europe in order to develop like more electrical vehicle can be a hurdle for that. Yeah, so that's the kind of thing. I don't expect the cannibalization to be much bigger due to the law compared to what we expect at the beginning. Nonetheless, cannibalization will happen. I know that France didn't see that much cannibalization in the past, but it will definitely happen in the near future.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the answer, Alexander. Also, thanks a lot to Joshua for the answer. So the key question I think that we have been seeing throughout this presentation, but that we will also be putting central on the 29th of June is this new law accelerating or slowing down the outroll of solar PV? So we've gotten a great introduction today. So I would like to thank our two excellent speakers once more for the presentation. It was a pleasure to host you. As you can see, for those who are still with us in the webinar here, there is a 10% discount code applicable for you. So if you use this code and you register on the website, you will get a 10% off on your ticket. So I hope to see many of you there. Alexander, Joshua, thanks one more time. And I wish you all a great evening.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.